Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is August 24th, 2018, and my guest is Paul Bloom, the Brooks and Suzanne Reagan Professor of Psychology and Cognitive Science at Yale University. This is Paul's second EconTalk appearance. In February of 2017, he talked about his book, Against Empathy. Today our topic is cruelty. And I want to say up front that anyone listening with young children may want to screen this episode in advance, as we are likely to discuss some disturbing behavior. Paul, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks so much for having me back.
So this conversation is going to be based on 3 essays you've written, one in the New York Times with Sam Harris, one in the Times with Yale graduate student Matthew Jordan, and one you wrote in the New Yorker. We'll link to all of them. I want to start with the piece in the New Yorker. You're reacting in that piece to a very standard argument that human cruelty is driven by dehumanization, that we see the people that we oppress often as less than human, as animals. How's that argument go? Flesh it out.
So it's not a bad argument. I think it's an argument that's right in many cases. An argument is that some of the worst things we do to other people are because we don't think of them as people. We dehumanize them. We think of them as animals or as machines or as material objects, but we strip away their humanity. And once we do so, it licenses us to do all sorts of terrible things to them. If I think of you as a person, I can't, then it's morally wrong for me to take away your property or to kill you because you get in my way. But if you are a rat or a vermin or a cockroach, then it's totally fine. And so a lot of really smart scholars, humanists, social scientists, have argued that dehumanization is one of the big causes of evil and cruelty in the world. And my article in the New Yorker was looking at this critically, talking about it, looking at the arguments in favor, but also pointing out that this may not be entirely right, that there's a lot more going on.
One thing I want to add is that over time we've gotten more respectful, I think accurately, but there's no way of knowing for sure, of the consciousness and worthiness of animal life. There's a certain irony here that even the whole idea of dehumanization is somewhat less compelling, because a lot of people think we should treat animals as at least as well as humans.
So there's all sorts of subtleties here. We got a puppy, not somewhat against my will, but we have a puppy nonetheless. And we were playing with the puppy last night, and we were having a great time. And the puppy is not even close to human, but I would never hurt it or harm it. That sounds horrible. In fact, I think we are harsher towards people who harm innocent animals than those who harm people. And so even on the outset, the idea that once you don't think of somebody as human, all the moral rules go away has its difficulties. You're right. But
you make a deeper point. So what was your other criticism or main criticism of this dehumanization theory?
So I'm drawing on the work here of a lot of people, particularly the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah and the philosopher Kate Manne. And in different ways, they both make the following argument, which is that if you look at the actual atrocities people do to each other, the Holocaust and slavery and misogynistic violence, you don't necessarily see dehumanization in any sense of the term. Rather, what you see is a full recognition of the humanity of other people. So Appiah points out that, in genocide in say, Germany in World War II, there were all sorts of humiliations and degradations done towards the Jews. And it's hard to make sense of this if you said the Germans didn't think of the Jews as people. Rather, they thought of them as people, and they wanted them to suffer as people. They felt that they were morally tainted as people. They recognized their humanity and hated it. And
incredibly deep insight, just very depressing, but incredibly deep.
That's right, and others have made it as well. There's a scholar of the Holocaust who I quote who says, you might think what happened in these death camps as dehumanization, and some of it was, but some of it is also just a desire to dominate, to degrade, to humiliate, and you don't do that with creatures you don't view of as fellow people. And Kate Mann in this wonderful, I think a really wonderful, very powerful book called Down Girl, makes a similar argument about misogyny and misogynistic violence. So she says, it's a standard view in a lot of feminist philosophy is that men objectify women. Men think of women as mere things. This is a common analysis of pornography, say. But she takes a lot of case studies and argues, I think, convincingly that when men act really badly towards women, often it's because men expect things from women. Men feel cheated. They feel disrespected. And these are attitudes you have towards other people, not towards animals.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think there's probably a distinction to be made between people on the ground working in concentration camps in Nazi Germany, guards in the Gulag in Soviet Russia, and their job was probably easier if they thought of their charges as less than human.
Yes.
The tattoos of numbers on the arms of Jews is just an obvious example. The relentless cruelties of prison life, the pettiness, and the suffering that's imposed on people, I think, probably at some point allows the people running the system on the ground to be inured to the humanity of the people they're working with. And, the flip side of this, of course, is that a doctor has to somehow objectify a human being at times and should to do the job correctly. A surgeon, a doctor giving advice to a family. So there's something understandable about that, certainly and laudable about it in situations of compassion and kindness. In the case of cruelty, it's unbearable. But I would think that the point you're making about that it's their explicit humanity that they want to destroy is certainly coming from the architects. And somewhat on the ground as well. The petty humiliation that you talk about and the pleasure that people get from that. Now, let
me just get, because you're raising so many things there. Look, I agree. I think a lot of the stuff on the ground, as it were, really is dehumanization. These are often the people who do the most terrible things. Have no wish, have no animus to harm other people, so they just tell themselves these are not people. And that just makes it go easier.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that even in our modern world, a lot of military action, which is done at a distance, isn't done because I'm going to take my vengeance and I'm going to make these people suffer. Rather, it's just that I'm going to just think of these. I'm going to code them as combatants, and that's all I'm going to think of them.
Yeah, I'm playing a video game. Yeah. Yeah,
exactly. And so I think you get both. So there's a lot of historians of the Holocaust and historians of massacres and genocide more generally who point out a lot of people really enjoy this stuff. Yeah. Books like Hitler's Willing Executioners and Ordinary Men. Yep. Sort of, I think, put aside the myth that all of the villains in the Holocaust were these, people, these kind people who decided who had to be obedient.
Yeah, just
following orders.
They're
That's right.
automatons, or they have a German culture of respect for authority. And
that's right. There's enough stories that people went above and beyond orders and took pleasure in it. And I think probably some proportion are actually honest to God sadists or psychopaths. But I think a lot of people who do terrible things say, well, these people have it coming to them.
Yeah. Well, and also I think we'll come to this in a minute, but I think I say this with some unease, but I think all of us have a little sadist in us, or many of us do.
I think I'd say all of us.
Not my mom, but
not your mom.
Who was just a article, but it reminds me also of the somewhat recent episode we did with on EconTalk with Mike Munger on slavery and the eagerness in the Americas and how eager slave owners were to perceive Africans as inferior and as to justify what they were doing as compassionate, not just, well, it's okay, I'm cruel to them. It's more like I'm doing them a service because they can't run their own lives.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole literature on this written by people trying to justify themselves. They say, what do you treat what do you treat better? Do you treat something you rent better or something you own better? Certainly, if you own something, you treat it better, you take care of it.
Yeah.
And that's why the relationship between a master and a slave is a moral one. And these people are working very hard to frame what they're doing as morally good.
Yeah, I'll never forget the quote. I heard it from David Henderson. I think it's from a transcript, and I don't know if it's literally true, but it's good enough. Whether it's true or not, it could be apocryphal. But it's the runaway slave caught, and now before a judge, and the judge is saying, "Well, how'd your master treat you?" And explains he had food, he had a bed, and the judge said, "Well, it doesn't sound so bad." And the slave says, "Well, there's an opening if you're interested." and it's so easy to strip away, especially the intangible parts of this. And we're doing a book club on EconTalk on Solzhenitsyn's In the First Circle, and the relentless petty humiliation of one's humanity in that setting of the prison camp, even in a nice camp, in quotes, which is what Solzhenitsyn was in and what she writes about in that book. It's so what the irony of our conversation is, it is dehumanizing. The treatment is dehumanizing.
Yes.
Your point is that it's not the dehumanizing that allows the treatment.
That's right. I'm more interested in what goes on in people's heads when they do cruel things. In some sense, this is obviously all dehumanizing. But I'm very interested in the claim that when we are cruel to others, it's because we stripped them of their humanity and don't think of them as people. And, just to go back to your bigger point you made, I guess what I try to argue in the New Yorker article is it's more complicated in two ways. So in one way, it's not the case that if I recognize your humanity, all of a sudden I'll be kind to you. Maybe if I recognize your humanity, I will despise you. I will envy you. I will want to dominate you, which gets to the sadism part. So it's a mixed bag. Recognizing other people as people by no means makes us kind. And then the flip side, which you mentioned briefly, which always fascinated me, is that treating you not as a human also isn't necessarily a bad thing. A surgeon, there's a wonderful phrase by Atul Gawande, a surgeon treats his or her patient as a problem to be solved. Mm-hmm. I think a utilitarian philosopher goes around to make the world a better place, but doesn't actually think of each person as a person, understands they are people. But when you do the math and say, well, this will save 100 people and this will save 200 people, so we'll save 200 people, you really are thinking of things in mathematical terms. But in the same time, you could be making the world a much better place.
Yeah, I guess my natural thought there is that there's so many things that don't go into the math. That are hard to take account of. It's one of the problems I have with utilitarianism, but it's not the only one.
So this is a standard complaint about the utilitarian. A modern one, I think, is that the utilitarian is cold-blooded and doesn't understand the specialness, the distinctness of individuals. But sometimes I think in the real world, it's a feature, not a bug. I think that often our very worst decisions are made because we very much take into account individual cases, and we are moved by them. Say, I don't know, the murder of somebody by an immigrant, a gun death, a sexual assault, and our feelings about the particular individuals there, which will vary from person to person, will often distort policies in all sorts of crazy ways. Whatever you'd say about policymaking in our time by our government, I don't think it's too utilitarian.
Well, that's a good point. And it comes back to your book, Against Empathy.
It does, yes.
Encourage listeners to go back and read that book and to listen to our earlier conversation. And I'm very sympathetic to the point because, case by case, which is has an appeal. And we'll just go case by case. Is often fraught with all kinds of problems. At the personal level, I'll just see if this potato chip is worth having.
Yes.
It always is.
Yes.
Just one.
Yes.
And in the policy arena, it's negotiating with hostage. Someone holding a hostage. Having a rule that we do not negotiate with people who take hostages is a very powerful rule that you want to break every time when the family is crying. But if you look ahead to the consequences, you might decide that it's better to suffer the consequences now to prevent further harm in the future. And I think that's an incredibly important point.
I think so too. I recently watched the most recent Mission Impossible movie, Fallout. It was a good movie. The first half I thought was great, but on not one, not two, but three occasions, somebody says,
"Spoiler alert! Hang on, any spoiler
alert!" But this will not harm. This will not harm you. No more than what you've seen in the trailer. Says to the main character, Ethan Hunt, the Tom Cruise character, "You are a great person, and you are a great person because you believe that the life of one person matters more than the life of a million." And I'm there like saying, "Hey, I want to rebut."
Yeah,
no, that isn't
a minute here.
The movie is orchestrated that favoring the one over the million works out because it's a movie.
Correct.
But
yeah.
It's actually a horrific policy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I as an economist, there's many movies I can't enjoy because they bother me for those kind of reasons, and that bothered me too. I knew I was being manipulated there. I was supposed to think that Cruise was honorable for his putting an actual human life first, but actually is endangering many, many more. And it's actually the only thoughtful thing in the whole movie. The movie is an extended chase scene, but that tension over the life in your own hands that's visible and tangible versus longer term cost. They beat it to death. I just want to say, I was very disappointed in the movie, and I was, but that's neither here nor there. But that's an excellent point. It's really exactly right.
A colleague of mine, Molly Crockett, has just published a paper with several other people supporting the idea, which I think you and I know intuitively, that people like deontologists. They like people who have moral rules. They like people who favor their friends and their family, and they have little patience for utilitarians, even for effective altruists. I think that, I think there's interesting reasons why we are constituted that way, but the utilitarian has few friends. And I got to say, this is a problem with your discipline, which very much leans utilitarian.
Yeah, it's true. Well, some of us deserve fewer friends, perhaps. I'm gonna make an observation here to get your reaction. It's not really the point of your essay, but I find it interesting how hard it is for people to accept the possibility that people enjoy being cruel.
Yeah. You had Jordan Peterson on your show.
Yep.
And twice?
Once.
Okay. I listen, and I disagree with Jordan Peterson. I haven't met him. I disagree with him about a lot of things. But there's one thing he says which I think is true and important and doesn't get said enough, which is he talks about the desire for power and domination. And he talks coherently, but says, look, people get a pleasure and a satisfaction about, dominating others. And it's not sadism, strictly speaking. I think what it is that we're hierarchical creatures.
Yep.
And we want to be on top. And there's all sorts of ways of being on top. There's to be respected and to be admired. But failing that, terrifying somebody and making them fall, before you is a go-to some individuals use.
While we're talking about movies, I recently saw Richard Curtis interviewed. It's going around on Twitter, this clip. He's the director of Love Actually, which, for better or for worse, is one of my top 10 movies for watchability. I love that movie.
Well, you are a contrarian.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm not, but among our friends, yeah. And because a lot of people seem to like it. But he makes sentimental movies. And he defends it, saying he thinks people are basically good. He says if you make a movie about a sadist who deserts from the army and violates a woman who's pregnant, a nurse. That's gritty realism. My movie about people falling in love is considered sappy and sentimental, but he said there are 1 million people falling in love in England right now, and that's real life. He's trying to defend this idea that people are basically good. And although I like the movie and I like to think personally, I do occasionally like to believe that people are basically good. I don't necessarily think that's the best way to approach life, but it's a good way to approach your friends, for sure.
Yeah, and I think people are basically complicated. I'm a developmental psychologist, and sometimes I get the question, are babies innately good or innately bad? And I always answer yes. It's just we have both appetites, and I think part of the badness for all of us, maybe except for your mother, is a desire to be on top, to dominate, or at least not to be on the bottom, and that doesn't really necessarily mean I have to round up a bunch of people and put them in a camp and sit in a guard tower and take pot shots at them. But the appetite that makes us do that is, I think, a sort of grotesque and exaggerated form of an appetite that exists in all of us.
Yeah, it's related to the Adam Smith point about, which listeners know well, man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. And he takes the to be loved part as a given, not only to be. Of course, we want to be loved. Of course, we want to be paid attention to. Of course, we want to be respected, admired, honored. And when we don't receive that, we don't take it so well. And it's just something I'm increasingly aware of, something that economists have zero insight into after Adam Smith, unfortunately, or not, but that's, I think, the reality. And it's a big part of human life. It's a big part of work. It's something I think economists have ignored, which is too bad.
It is. Tom Tyler, a colleague of mine at Yale Law School, has a lot of evidence that what matters to people the most in their workplace is the feeling of being respected, and being respected, being treated as a serious individual, worthy of a creature of dignity, is worth a lot of money.
Yeah,
and it's also, I think, the right thing to do. But I think that this desire actually can bleed into the almost sadism we're talking about earlier. I was having an argument with my family, people around the room who I love the most in the world, but I feel like I wasn't being heard. There was an argument going, and I couldn't get get the words, and I wasn't being heard, and I felt this frustration. And and it's very human to say, no, let me speak. You listen to me. You listen to me, you respect my views. And it's not the prettiest trait.
So why is it that in a faculty meeting where you have something deep and profound to say, Paul, which I'm sure is all the time, but in a particular case where you feel you actually have something important to contribute, and you can't get a word in, and your insight's lost, and people didn't give you a chance to get your insight across, you get a little bit annoyed. But with your family who you love, it can be infuriating. Why? What's the difference there? It should be the other way around. It's like, I love these people. I'm not going to get mad at them. Why do we care more sometimes in those settings?
So that gets back to the whole issue of humanization and treating people as people, and it connects to the misogyny work of Kate Mann. And the answer is, I like my fellow faculty members. Many of them are good friends, but I love my family. And because I love my family, their rejection, their failure to take me seriously, their failure to listen to my 7 points about why Trump will not be reelected, and to fully appreciate it.
Deep insights.
It was really bothered me.
Yep.
Well, my colleagues listening to my plan to recruit 10 graduate students to work with me. Screw that. And of course, this is reflected, more seriously. In fact, I'm far more likely to kill my family.
Yeah, it's horrifying, isn't it? Yeah.
Because and this is the thing. This is how I end the New Yorker article, and which is that there's this view we have that if only we were to that. The dehumanization view is a very optimistic view because it says that so much of the badness that we do is based on a mistake. I'm just not recognizing humanity.
You just need re-educating. You just need a sensitivity session.
I need a sensitivity session. I need to see some slides. I need to talk to them.
Yeah. Once you talk to them, you won't hate them anymore.
Once I talk to them, it'll all be worked out. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes we make about morality. I think that the reality is that fully appreciating someone's humanity opens up so many positive things. You can't be human without it. You can't have a decent relationship. It's the foundation of love and friendship, but it carries with it so many terrible risks. Really loving somebody, really knowing somebody opens up the possibility for love, but it also opens up the possibility for hatred.
So unintuitive, but it's so true. Talk about that some more.
So I like Mann's analysis here, and she talks about she gives an example of Elliott Rogers. So Elliott Rogers is this kid in California. He left a video describing his motivations, and he went on a shooting spree and killed many people. And he was in some way the first incel. He argued that he claimed that he was killing people not because he didn't see them as people, but because they rejected him.
Got a grievance.
He had a grievance. That's a lovely term, grievance. You don't have a grievance against a dog or a rock. You have a grievance against a person. And he had grievances against the beautiful women who he said scorned him and wouldn't sleep with him. He had a grievance against, I think they call them Chaz, these handsome young men who were romancing and having sex with these beautiful young women. And he felt left out. He felt, and there's this profound resentment. There's this profound feeling of grievance. And I think that sort of instance captures the psychology of cruelty maybe better than the picture, which sometimes is true, of somebody gunning down a bunch of people because he thinks they're monkeys.
Yeah. I keep thinking about the fact that, the flip side of this, and I write about this in my Adam Smith book, if I'm having an argument with a family member and I'm just really frustrated and angry, which I hope doesn't happen very often, but it does happen, and I get a phone call, and for reasons not worth going into, I have to take it.
Yeah.
Somehow I go, oh, hello. I say hello. I don't say,
yes.
I don't say, what do you want? I just say hello, because I can turn that off when I want to. And yet I can't turn it off sometimes in the middle of that argument, which is strange. And I think part of what's going on there is the love-hate thing, is that I want your respect, Paul, right? Because I think you're a smart person and you have achievements, and it would make me happy if you walked away from this interview telling your friends, boy, that was a great experience. EconTalk's a great program, blah, 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 right? It's going to make me feel good. I'm not going to – you can send me a video, by the way, if you want. But just –
this happened after our last conversation.
Of course it did. For hours. And I really appreciate it.
So now I don't know whether there might be diminishing returns.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I would do, in the abstract, do like your respect. But my wife's respect, that matters a lot more to me, right? And so it's not – even though I can tell myself, well, of course she respects me. She's my wife. I think in the day-to-day tension we have with the people closest to us, that can be a challenge. We expect so much more of the people around us. And the flip side of that, which also drives me crazy, is I can be disrespectful to my family. I use the example of taking a phone call. That'd be one example. I would never do that in the middle of an argument with you in person. But I can disrespect them and rationalize them and say, well, they're my family. They love me anyway. I don't have to really treat them that well all the time. When it really, to me, morally, it should go the opposite. I should put them on a pedestal constantly.
Yeah. There's of all things, I'm remembering a story I heard from a rabbi once, and it's about this guy and his wife they're at a hotel, and his wife is fumbling to get something out of her bag because he needed the front desk. And the guy, and they've been married for 30 years, the guy looks at the guy behind the desk and rolls his eyes.
Yeah.
And the point of the story is,
it's a fantastic story.
You're betraying how bad that is.
Yeah.
And it's the sort of thing I could see myself doing. I can see it, but you're betraying somebody you love to a stranger, showing this dominance. But that's part of the package. There's this study, and I don't know if this is true. This was from a long time ago, sort of thing you say in interest, but it rings true. It was I forget the word. It was done by a marriage expert, And they took videotapes of couples interacting, and they wanted to predict what aspects of interactions predicted that their relationship would break up. And it turned out in this story that it wasn't whether or not they were quiet or noisy, not even whether they screamed at each other and fought. It was whether they showed contempt for each other.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Contempt is like the relationship killer. It means, you are no longer, we've gone beyond grievances here.
Well, today you could argue contempt's the opposite of respect, and without that, you can't have a marriage. In my view, a good marriage, you can't have a good friendship. But going back to just to bring us full circle, and I'm going to shift gears at this point, but going back to the hotel front desk story, when you roll your eyes with a stranger or a friend over your spouse's behavior, that is the ultimate dehumanization of your spouse. That's what you're saying is, I'm going to use this moment of frailty, of human imperfection, that say my spouse is disorganized. Yeah. And I'm going to use it as a source of camaraderie and humor with you, the stranger. I'm going to treat it like a clip from a movie that we might both react to. It's a bad idea.
Yeah, and that brings up something which I don't think I did. I gave enough time and respect to in the New Yorker article, which is, treating somebody as a person has all sorts of moral risks, but there's dehumanization of that sort in everyday life. And it could really be ugly, and it could be a relationship killer. And maybe one way of looking at the contempt finding, if it's true, is that you don't even think of the person as worth being, as if that contempt is a dehumanizing emotion, and that's fatal for a relationship.
And I just want to close with a really sappy story, which I think I try to think of. I don't think about it often enough, but it's either a cartoon or a video where it shows a person going through their day, and each of the people that the main character encounters, instead of seeing them as human beings, they're just the thing that they're doing. So the janitor is just a broom, physically a broom, or as a broom for a head while they're sweeping up, and the bus driver is a steering wheel rather than an actual human being. And it's easy to point that out, that's often the way we treat folks who help us in our lives that way. I think it's an interesting challenge about how to overcome that. I try to say thank you. I walked into the mall one Sunday to do an errand, and there was a woman pulling together some garbage bags from the outside trash can, and I just said I smiled at her and said thank you. Made me feel good, by the way. Repeating it, of course, didn't earn your respect, Paul. But more seriously, I thought about that. That's a minimal thing to do but maybe she thought I'm crazy. Like, why is he thanking me? But for me, it's a way to say, I don't see you as a robot who happens to pick up trash. I see you as a fellow human being who's doing something that makes my life a little bit better.
It's a struggle because, this anthropologist Fisk talks about these different levels in which we interact with each other, and there's a market level where you pay your money, you get your product, and things go smoothly, and it's based on autonomy and mutual consent. But then there's also the friendship model. If I go to your house and you make me a nice meal, I don't give you money afterwards. That would be disrespectful. I would suggest I have the wrong model. But in so much of our life, the problem is you're dealing with people and you have to navigate both, and it's very difficult. It took me a long time. At some point in our lives, my wife and I got somebody to clean our house because we had a very messy house and we had some affordable income, and we viewed as the person who cleans our house benefits from it. But it felt so weird having somebody walking around my house picking up my stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a strange thing, right? And they're very glad to have that that money that you pay them for picking up your stuff. My view on that, I think I've talked about on the program before, is, when my kids would throw up, I would not say, well, the cleaning lady's coming tomorrow or tonight or in an hour. I'll just leave it for them because that's what we pay them for, isn't it? And the answer is not really. I got to clean that up. So I think there are cultural rules about what's considered acceptable, and so it's a very interesting question when there's a large gap. It's one of the places where I think inequality is real. When I invite a person into my house to clean my house whose life is not the same as mine, and she is going to be in my space for 2 hours with her crew or an hour, and that's a little bit weird. Her car is nicer than mine. It makes me happy, and I always like to point that out. But I say that actually, it's not really a joke. The point of that is I think is real. That it's true that I have certain things she doesn't have. My house is probably bigger than hers, but there are many things she has that are not so bad. And so it depends where you are, what country you're in, what culture you're in, what the future holds. It's a little bit complicated.
Yes, the morality of it, the psychology of it. I think this is a case where maybe ethical philosophers have let us down, because I don't see any good guidelines on how are we to properly deal with each other in these market circumstances. And it is often complicated and troubling, and it's often a source of embarrassment and humor because it's such a difficult, troubling situation. And obviously there are gender and racial issues that arise here.
For sure. With class and income.
Yes. Yeah.
What I do, a small step, is I ask them what kind of music they want, the cleaning crew. And they're from Central America. They want bachata music, which has its own station on Spotify. And I put it on. I blare it as loud as they want. I don't particularly like it. I've come to like it a little bit now, actually. It's growing on me. It's growing on me. It's not my style of music, but it's growing on me. And if I knew what the words were, I'd really like it, because I think it's very sentimental. Let's shift gears. Let's talk about the Derek Parfit thought experiment that you write about in a different article that we're going to now turn to. What was that thought experiment?
So this was some work I did with Matt Jordan, this wonderful graduate student at Yale. And Parfit is one of my favorite philosophers, a lot of people's favorite philosopher. He passed away very recently, very sadly, and this brilliant and very moral person. And he had this thought experiment in Reasons and Persons. He called it the Harmless Torture. And the idea is, I'm going to sort of simplify it a little bit, but just as to get the form that I remember. But there's somebody who's in a tiny bit of pain, and you could press a switch, and by pressing a switch, you add to their pain. It's electric shock, say. But you add to it so infinitesimally that they don't even notice there's a difference. And you walk around throwing the switch on 1,000 people, not affecting anybody. But there's also somebody behind you, and he's also throwing the switch on 1,000 people. And there's, say, 1,000 people. And as a result of everybody throwing the switch, each individual ends up in terrible agony. So as a sort of group, you have all tortured all these people. But as an individual, you haven't increased the misery of not a single person. Or if you have, you've done it in a very tiny way. And this is sort of one of these odd thought experiments designed to sort of explore utilitarianism and so on. But what was interesting about it is, I think what Matt and I argued is, it lives itself out now in social media. It's in that, I get somebody says something really bad about me on Facebook. I look at it, somebody likes it. It's not a big deal. But then in the end of the day, 1,000 people have liked it, and I feel crushed. I feel humiliated. And so this is a sort of social mobbing that happens where what's interesting about this for us is nobody's doxing anybody. There's no rape threats. There's no death threats. There's just the accumulation of tiny acts that in the end have terrible consequences through our technology. And so we explore that. We talk about this in the context of microaggressions. This writer, Julian Sanchez, makes the point that a lot of small insults, each one very minor, maybe not even a problem, but if you get a lot of them, it could just grind you down. And we take that as a moral issue people should take seriously.
I think it's extremely interesting and important. We had an episode with Megan McArdle on internet shaming that I thought was really she was fantastic. And it's, the flip side of that, of course, is that, well, some people deserve not you, Paul, of course, but some people deserve a comeuppance. And all this is a modern way of sending moral signals to people that they've done the wrong thing.
So I've heard that, and
I don't like it either.
I wouldn't doubt that in some cases, we're really hitting at the right person, and maybe the effect will actually be a good one. I just think in the real world, in the cases that I see so often, first, they're always punching down. There are always somebody, some obscure schmo who's done something stupid, who's been caught on the worst 30 seconds of their life. And there it is on a video. So it's often punching down. It's often based on false information. Just the most recent case, like a week ago, there was some film with some guy catching a baseball.
Oh, yeah. It's a fantastic example.
And he keeps it.
He takes it. He takes it. He takes it away from a small child, it appears.
That's right.
Either the kid bobbles it and he grabs it, or I think that's what happens.
That's exactly right. And then so, of course, Twitter goes berserk.
Monster.
And the answer is, well, now let's ruin his life.
Yeah, he deserves it.
Ruin his life. Let's make sure he loses his job. He can't live anywhere. Maybe he'll kill himself. And then it turns out like 5 minutes later, it's revealed that he had given like 3 balls to the kid in front of him. And then later on, he gave it to his wife. Then she gave it to the kid.
I think what happened is, I'm a big baseball fan, Paul, so I was really interested in this. And I also have taken many of my children to games, and I'm very interested in getting a ball.
I'm faking all my sports knowledge.
Yeah, I can see this. So what actually happened is that the clip ends with him seemingly gleefully taking the ball from this little kid, but it turns out he's giving it to another kid who's in a different spot, 2 seats over. The kid in front had already either gotten 1 or gotten 2, which is absurd, but they were sitting near the field and had been tossed to them by a player, and I think. So anyway, it's a perfect example of, you didn't know the whole story. You went down this guy's throat. But I want to take a different tack on this.
Okay.
Let's suppose that's where the clip really did end. That's where it should have ended. He's a jerk. Maybe he never got a ball as a kid himself. Maybe he's just likes baseballs. Maybe he didn't like that kid in front of him. Maybe he's just selfish. The idea that this somehow is irredeemable, that this deserves, there's no limit to what punishment this deserves. It's like when, I don't want to pick an example, but there's so many, where some public figure does something stupid in their youth, say, and now they're up for this new job as editor of this magazine, or star in this movie, or running for office, or appointed to this position. And somehow that one mistake is considered decisive. The idea is that we now know, because we've seen this clip or we've read this quote from when the person was 20 years old or 5 years ago, that obviously they're a bad person, as if you can just put people in boxes. And I think that's an evil thing to do, to presume that people are either good or bad, and therefore that's dehumanizing. Basically saying this person is irredeemable and they deserve everything that comes down on them.
I agree. You have, there's John Ronson's wonderful book, Got Us All Started, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, where he looks at these cases of people who have been attacked by mobs and had their lives ruined through social media. And he points out some of them are guilty. Like some of them did do something pretty bad. But there's no sense of mercy or justice or proportion. The legal system has this. Bureaucratic systems have it. If I steal some paper clips from the front office, maybe I get in trouble, but I wouldn't lose my job. And even informal social system like families have it.
Yep.
So if my kid bails on me when he's supposed to get together for me for lunch, I'd say, well, that's really rude. And maybe I sulk and maybe we have some bad, harsh words, but I'm not going to take him out of my will. Yeah. I'm not going to lock the door so he can't get back in the house.
Maybe a page of it. Not the whole thing. He might lose a couple things, but yeah.
He loses a percentage each time he does something bad. But it's proportional and balanced because people live together, and it makes sense. If you and I are part of the same family, we want proportionality because even for just self-interest, one day you'll do something wrong. And the problem with social media, I think you're right. Even if the person did it, even if all the facts are out there, it's just a mob. And it's just a mob that and people jumping into the mob because of the pleasure they get. In part, it's a pleasure of punishment. I think it's in part it's a pleasure of affiliation.
Yeah, some signaling going on there big time, as you point out, I think.
I've never been part of a group that stoned somebody, but it's not hard for me to see how much fun that must be. To be part of the people throwing the rocks and screaming, the feeling of course,
justice.
Yeah. I enjoy the same. Maybe I enjoy the same movies as you do, and a lot of these movies kind of pull on our vicarious feelings of justice.
Yeah, our desire to do them.
How good it is. I don't know if I would be Dirty Harry, but I sure like watching Dirty Harry.
You're right. When you're talking about this internet shaming, but isn't this death by 1,000 cuts a good thing? If it were Hitler, wouldn't you be right to let him have it? Yes. But the problem is that when we are infused with moral outrage, acting as part of a crowd, and operating in a virtual world with no fixed system of valuation, law, or justice, all our enemies are Hitler.
Yes. And I've actually seen that literally on Twitter. I've seen people say, well, I think we should hear this person out. And they say, would you hear out Hitler?
Yeah.
Well, it's Hitler, I think, is a terrible paradigm for everyday moral judgments and moral responses. So my view is, and people, I've had pushback on this. We tried to make our examples both sort of liberal and conservative because the mob has gone after both.
Yeah.
The mob has, the mob has gone after people for on all sides of the political spectrum.
For sure.
This is not meant as a critique against marginalized groups speaking out against bad people, but it is, and it's also not against somebody who I said some critical remarks on in our article. Said there was something hypocritical about it. Bloom is against public shaming, but there he is criticizing me. But I'm not against public criticism or debate.
No.
If you dismantle my arguments over Twitter and everything, that may not be fun for me, but that's actually, I think, a good thing. It's just that if you post a funny picture of me falling in a puddle of mud and 15,000 people retweet it with the word loser on it, that's a different story.
Yeah, just cruelty. It's not.
Yes, cruelty.
And I just want to mention that we talk a lot on this program about bootleggers and Baptist theory of regulation, where politicians will invoke high-minded principles. That's the Baptist side, say, for not having liquor sales on Sunday. But then they're really also taking care of their bootlegger friends who make the donations to their campaign on the sly, because bootleggers benefit from liquor stores being closed on Sunday.
Yes. And
I think that's a very important perspective on politics, but it's also a very important perspective on our own humanity. And we will do evil things, and that's the because we enjoy them. That's the bootlegger side. But we'll explain that. Well, it's important to shame this loser because he's a bad person. So that's the Baptist side. So I feel virtuous. It's not just that I'm cruel to somebody online. I'm going to feel virtuous about it because that's where we're at right now.
Right, and that's sort of a theme which pulls together the conversations about the New Yorker article and about this article. What they have in common is that the people who are being cruel don't think of themselves as villains. They don't even think of themselves as morally neutral. They think of themselves as good people.
Crusaders.
They're to strike at somebody who is doing something wrong is easily seen as a good thing. And there's nothing, it's not irrational. Sometimes it is a good thing.
Yep.
One of the sort of things, Evolutionary Psych 101 says the only way we could be good people to each other as a society and as a species, the only way goodness could survive is if we have some mechanism in place to punish or shun people who are not good. Otherwise, goodness is a crappy strategy and will just fall by the wayside. And this is true, I think, from an evolutionary point of view, but it's also true on a societal point of view, which is you want there to be cops, and for situations that don't demand the level of cops, you want people to be able to say to each other, hey, dude, that was really racist. You shouldn't talk like that. Or, I'm not going to invite you to my parties anymore if you throw up all over the furniture.
I think the real issue here is the magnitude of the punishment.
Exactly.
So let's say that guy really did steal the ball from the kid, and his wife might look at him and say, that was awful. Now, she's not going to roll her eyes at the guy on the other side of her husband. But let's say she turns to her husband and says, that's not nice. Well, that's probably an appropriate response. Certainly it's an appropriate response to your child who's kept it, your teenage kid who's taken the ball from the 7-year-old in the front row in front of you. But it shouldn't get a death sentence. It shouldn't get a get you fired from your job. And most people, I think, but it's just wrong. So it doesn't matter how big the penalty is. And one of the things I've learned from the Coase theorem, I hate that phrase, from Coase's article on social costs, is the idea that it's true that we should punish bad behavior. But if you punish bad behavior too much, there is such a thing. And as a result, you'll change people's incentives to do things that actually are important to do. Like you won't go to baseball games, say. You won't take your kid to a baseball game because you might get caught on film doing something horrible. And so I think we really need to work out the norms, not work out, but the norms and culture of these kind of issues of public clips and shaming and all that. It's going to change. I think various things will respond, and I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I don't think it's going to be exactly the same way it is right now.
That's an optimistic point of view. I mean, in some way, in our article, we blame technology because normally, if I say to you, oh, you've been a jerk, well, I'm saying that to you. I'm face to face. I'm saying that to you. I understand the consequences. I understand what I'm doing. But if I tweet that at you
anonymously sometimes,
anonymously, and then 1,000 other people do it, I'm part of a group. My own intention was never to destroy your life, perhaps, or I probably don't need to think about it that much. But we are ill-equipped to think about the magnitude of such things. And this made me rethink something which I was was a bit skeptical of. I read this article by Julius Sanchez, and he talks about in terms of what are now called microaggressions. And I used to roll my eyes a little bit about some of this, but it's not hard to see if you think about it. There's a parallel thing where imagine I say something to you, and it's a joke. Maybe it's a remark about something, and in itself, it's no big deal. And if you don't call me out about it, I'd say you are so touchy, it is no big deal. But maybe if it's multiplied, maybe if you experience this 100 times each day, your life becomes unbearable. And although my own act in and of itself was no big deal, I am part of a general problem that makes you miserable. And so I think we need to respect the fact that often we will feel that we had no bad intentions and we will be right. And yet we can appreciate that our own small acts, when accumulated, make people's life miserable. And so we should stop these small acts.
Yes, the categorical imperative. It's Kant.
Yes,
right?
It is exactly right.
You should decide, even though your snide remark, cheap shot, raised eyebrow is not a big deal, you should be aware of the fact that if everyone did it, it would be unbearable, and therefore you shouldn't do it even once. And I think people very easily rationalize that. My silly example is the people who eat grapes out of the grocery store bags. Just one. I mean, they let you do it because the bag's open. I mean, obviously they don't mind if you do it. Well, they don't mind. What they do is they raise the price of grapes to include the fact they have to, or they wouldn't make money. Yeah. Right? All of shoplifting is included in the price of the food we eat. So it's true, any one shoplifter has a trivial effect. But if lots of people start shoplifting, which they do, of course, there is shoplifting.
Yep.
Everybody pays a price, and that's stealing for obvious reasons.
Yep.
But anyway, let's turn to the last essay.
Yeah.
Which is in many ways the most interesting one, and I hope we can go a little bit over time if that works for you.
Definitely.
You wrote an essay on Westworld. We're going to talk a little bit about that program. Talk about the premise of the show and what your observations on it. This is your article with Sam Harris.
That's right. And this grew out. I was on, no offense, but I was on another podcast with Sam Harris.
What were you thinking?
Lack of fidelity. And we got to talking about Westworld, and the two of us decided we should turn our thoughts into an article. And so the premise of Westworld, for people who haven't seen it, and we wrote it based on season 1, which was considerably simpler, I think, is that there's a futuristic amusement park, which is like the Wild West, with bandits and prostitutes and bartenders. But they're robots. They're humanoid robots, indistinguishable from people. And you, as a vacationer, can go there and interact with them. And you can go, as they say in the show, you could be a white hat and just like have adventures and try to save damsels in distress, or even just use it as sort of a vacation land or families who go there with children. But you can also go black hat, which means you could rape, you could murder, you could torture. these robots. And you're allowed to do this because you're not harming people. And so Sam and I are very interested in the morality of that. And so we explore the issue, and we make sort of two general points. One point is that we don't know, it's impossible to tell whether or not creatures as sophisticated as depicted in Westworld are sentient. And if they are, and even if there's any risk that they are, such behavior is terribly immoral. A second point is that even if they aren't, even if you know they aren't, even if you know they're like toasters, it might be morally corrosive to treat things that are indistinguishable from people in terrible ways. It might bleed over to your interactions with people. That's a speculation, but we think it's plausible. And I guess I'll also say just a third point, while I'm monopolizing the stage, which is that it is a meta point is it's an interesting way to do philosophy. Philosophers love thought experiments, but Westworld is itself a thought experiment, and having the robots played by such brilliant actors makes you feel the force of the fact that you shouldn't harm them. If I just told you about it, you might be clear, but if you watch the show, you'll see that the people who do terrible things to these robots are doing terrible things, and the TV show makes it clear in a way that other ways of expressing things aren't. And so I have this sort of pet idea that a lot of movies and TV shows, the movie Memento being another example, are actually themselves works of philosophy.
Well, I saw episode 1 of the series. Yeah. And my wife and I watch the occasional series together. We watch The Crown. Mm-hmm. We watched The Wire to span the entire range of degrading gritty realism to period pieces of termed existence. But I happened to watch that without her, and after watching, I realized it's not for her. She really doesn't like violence. She would be uncomfortable watching those robots getting killed because they bleed, just in case you haven't seen the show. But in the first episode, I found it so haunting. I could not stop thinking about the program. And I may go back and watch the rest of the season and maybe more, but I was just overwhelmed by how thought-provoking it was, even just the first episode, and how it jarred me, and how it's an incredibly well-made show. It's extraordinary. Let's start with the second point you made, and then I want to come back to the first a little more length. It's just interesting, this idea that it's morally corrosive. That would be the same argument against letting people play video games that have become increasingly, not stopping them, say legally, but not wanting your kids to play them because they become increasingly realistic, and that perhaps that makes it a little harder to treat human beings well. But it also reminds me of our conversation about animals, right? I think one of the arguments for treating animals well, even if they are not conscious, is that if you treat animals badly, you might have trouble treating humans well. And I think they're not unrelated. That would be the claim. I don't know if I find out if that's true or not, or whether it's just sort of, empty armchair theorizing.
I don't know if it's true either. Kant made the claim about animals because maybe either Kant or Descartes. One of them was committed to the views that animals didn't really feel pain, which is an unintuitive view to say the least. But then said you shouldn't harm them because it would lead you to be cruel to people who definitely do feel pain. And then there's the video game case. So it's sort of strange to find myself making this argument for Westworld because I think the video game case, the evidence is tremendously weak.
Yeah.
The idea that my kids would play extremely violent, first-person shooter games, and I wondered, is this going to turn them into the killers? And A, it didn't, but B, I had enough of understanding of literature to appreciate there's no evidence that it does, that it has any bad effect.
Go the other way, right? It's a way to get your aggressions out in a way that's harmless. It could easily be a positive.
So you could tell a catharsis view where it does go that way. I think that's too much. On the other hand, people like Steve Pinker correctly point out that the period in which the games have become more realistic and more violent is the same period in which violence in that age group has dropped a lot, and compassion towards minorities and outgroups has increased. So, if you're gonna make a big deal about these correlations, you'd have to be forced to the view that violent video games make us much nicer.
Yeah, I think that's ridiculous. But
so I think
FYI,
it's ridiculous.
But yeah. The correlation is not causation, and I'm not sure how much nicer we are to people really, and a lot of the darker sides of us are just bubbling on. I like to say the veneer of civilization's thin. I don't know.
That's interesting. I mean, that's sort of. I'll finish the thought, which is that that I do, however, think that actually raping somebody or beating up somebody or torturing somebody to death in a situation where they're materially indistinguishable from a person will lower your inhibitions towards doing it again towards real people. And I don't have empirical evidence for that, but I think it's a reasonable worry to have.
Yeah, I feel that way. Again, there's a cheap trick at the heart of Westworld, which is that they're not actual robots.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
They're actually people playing robots in a way that makes them very close to human, but not quite. So, and of course, that line, you don't have to be it's not a spoiler alert that's going to get blurred over time in the series. Yeah. It's what makes it so interesting. And, it illustrates what it would be like to have humanoid robots, which is they'd be indistinguishable from actors playing robots. Yeah. So if they got, as the technology advances, and it's an interesting thing. We tend to make our robots look like humans.
Yes.
In a generic sense, but not so much in a literal sense. And it'll be interesting to see how that evolves as the technology gets better, right?
I wonder, for reasons connected to what we were talking about before regarding our relationships to those who serve us, that there will be a movement to make robots look different from humans.
Yeah.
That some of them will be specifically built so you don't treat them as if they're humanoid, because the humanoid part of them might make it very difficult for you to use them in certain ways.
Of course, if you're worried about robots destroying humanity or abusing us, you'd want them as human as possible so we could hate them just like we can hate other people.
But you don't want them so human that they could mix in with us and then
exactly
subvert.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't think we've gotten nicer over the last 50 years in an interesting way?
I used to think that. I think that's one of the things I've learned from Jordan Peterson is that he reminds us that that's not necessarily the case. That I really don't. I think our potential for cruelty is unchanged. I think the fact that we're living in a liberal democracy, a representative government with a representative government, is it's an historical aberration. It may persist. That would be just grand, but it may not. And I am not nearly as optimistic or idealistic about that future as I was 10 years ago.
Huh. So you don't think our psychologies have changed? You think we so happen to find ourselves in an environment which rewards certain forms of kindness and good behavior, but if the environment goes away, and it could go away very quickly, we'll be back to where we started from, our worse?
Sure. Don't tell me you don't believe otherwise, that you believe otherwise. You don't think you said our psychology has changed. I'm not sure what that word means, psychology, but I don't think our nature's changed one whit since, say, the gladiators, or throwing people to the lions in ancient Rome, or leaving kids out on the hillside in Sparta, or Crusades massacring people, or the death camps of Auschwitz, the Gulag. No, you don't think we're all the same? Haven't changed at all?
I don't think our natures have changed. We're the products of evolution. We're mammals. We're primates. But I do think our psychologies as individuals in our culture have changed. So just to take, the attitudes of the people in my community towards sexual minorities, like gay people or trans people, are genuinely different than they used to be when I was a kid.
I agree with that.
But it's not that. You can imagine a case where, well, there's just more laws and there's more restrictions. And I can imagine some cases where people's attitudes are exactly the same, but you're forbidden to do or say different things. But at least in that example, I think the attitudes and feelings are genuinely different in a positive way.
I think so. I think the tougher case would be minorities, racial differences, religious differences. It really comes back to what we started with, right? People of different races are, quote, just like us, I think, more or less. Yeah. That view was wildly unpopular 100 years ago. It was believed that they weren't like us. We were better. Whoever we were, pick doesn't matter. Whoever they were doesn't matter. I guess part of my pessimism is the rise of tribalism that we've been talking a lot about on the program in the last few episodes and recently. And they desire to dehumanize, to oppress, to see others as not like us is so deeply embedded in us that I think we're capable of great cruelty to people we think are on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of – so, while there's increased tolerance of some types of behavior, some types of choices, some types of differences between people, I also see at the same time – get Nazis marching in Virginia, in America. And it's a tiny number. I don't want to be – I'm not paranoid. Yeah. But how did that happen? How did that become culturally like, wow? And I think that's just that's the veneer of civilization covering over what I think is still out there racially, religiously, a lot of hatred inside the human heart, which is a horrible thing to say. At the same time, I took my notes before the show and I wrote down things about how I'm increasingly eager to see people as being inherently good, and I think on a day-to-day, one-on-one basis, I think as I've gotten older, I think I'm better at that. I think that's a good thing. But at the global meta big picture level, I'm not sure we've made any progress. Well,
it's probably better to love people and distrust humanity than the other way around. But I see what you're saying, and everything you say rings true. But it was a really small number of people, and Nazis have marched in America before,
it's
in
true.
much greater number actually. Yeah. In World War II, they filled Central Park, and in Skokie they marched, and then the anniversary of the march was this joke. There was a dozen losers wandering around aimlessly, surrounded by thousands of Antifa members.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I guess the question is, we are entering. It is impossible to doubt the last few years have been very bad for cosmopolitanism and very good for tribalism. And this is, in some sense, goes back to the argument I was having last night with my family. And I can say much more here. Thank you.
We'll just put the video up online on that. You don't have to say anything else.
No, you don't want to see it. Which is what we have now, a kind of blip where it'll go back to normal, and then the next president will be
mainstream.
Joe Biden or Jeb Bush.
Lower the flag to half masks. Half masks say when half staff when a person of his party dies. Yeah,
that's right. Or will the next president be some or will things just get worse? And the tribal appetite, which definitely exists, will just get more and more play in modern life. And I tend to be an optimist. I tend to think this is this aberration we're living through now. But we'll know more in 5 years.
Yeah, boy, I'm on the other side of that one. My joke is it's going to be Oprah against Ronda Rousey in 2024.
That sounds right.
As opposed to Mitt Romney against, say, Joe Biden or whatever Joe Biden's equivalent will be in 2024. It's a good question.
Don't count out Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
Yeah, no, he's going to be strong.
Yeah,
really going to be strong.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's go back to Westworld. What was your first point, which we didn't get to, about why there's something disturbing about the program?
The first point is that the robots are probably sentient. I mean, it's impossible to know. It's the standard, undergraduate dormitory argument at 2 a.m. How can I know you're conscious? How can you know that I'm conscious? But these robots are of such sophistication and complexity, it beggars belief that they don't have feelings. And the fact, and you could say, well, they aren't, they aren't born like we are. They aren't human. They aren't made of flesh and bones like we are. But like most cognitive scientists, most psychologists, I would shrug and say, it's not clear that that matters. And so if you have in front of me a machine who begs for mercy, has a conversation, has goals, seems to have goals and desires, I think our very best bet is to say there's somebody home. And if there's somebody home, you then shouldn't treat them badly. And I guess what I'm saying is when these people walked onto Westworld and they saw these robots, they knew they were robots, but they talked with them, they should have said, I can't harm them because they are conscious.
Do you think it's wrong to put a dog to sleep that has cancer that you don't want to pay for the chemo?
No, I don't think that that's wrong. But that cuts across two different issues. And
I don't either, but I'm not sure why when I think about it.
One issue is that the question of killing is somewhat different. I would think that it probably is wrong to let a dog suffer in agony.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because putting the dog to sleep or curing the dog would take up too much time or be an inconvenience, to be too expensive. I don't think the issue is so much life or death. And I feel this way also regarding the manufacture of animals for food. It's not so much the killing, it's the suffering.
Yeah.
And there's every indication that those things in Westworld can suffer.
Yeah, I don't agree with you on that,
okay.
At least for now. I'm going to read your quote. You're right. The biggest concern is that we might one day create conscious machines, sentient beings with beliefs, desires, and most morally pressing, the capacity to suffer. Nothing seems to be stopping us from doing this. Philosophers and scientists remain uncertain about how consciousness emerges from the material world, but few doubt that it does. This suggests that the creation of conscious machines is possible. I agree with that, but I want to take a twist on it. You want to say something?
Nope.
So I've been thinking about this for a little while. I don't know if I have anything interesting to say, but I was stimulated by an insight of Harry Frankfurt about what makes us different from animals. His test is, can it have desires about its desires? So my example of that is, could a smart vacuum cleaner feel sadness at not having a chance at being a driverless car? And I think the answer to that is no. I don't think it would feel sadness. I had a guest on the show, Pedro Domingos, talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and he has this beautiful parable of a robot growing up alongside you, taking in all the data that you're taking in as a child, as an infant, and processing it with its own brain. And in theory, it could have consciousness. And my question would be, if you showed it at 40 years old, the teddy bear that you went to bed with every night, would it feel nostalgia? And one argument is, well, of course it would. It would have the same brain that you had. It would have the same emotional response. And I don't think that's obviously true. I just don't see it.
So what's the stopping point for you? Why do you think that these capacities you're pointing out, which are sophisticated capacities, somehow have to be embedded in flesh and can't be part of a machine?
I guess because fundamentally, it's an interesting. It's just an intuition, obviously, and
yeah.
It could be wrong for many reasons. One of which is religious feelings of something about a soul. It seems to me that a brain is not a computer. So the question is, okay, true, but can we create a machine that will exactly mimic a brain? And it's theoretically possible. Well, I guess, although some have suggested it's not on religious grounds, that the material complexity of it is the issue. The way the brain is grown, it just can't be mimicked literally, but maybe it could be. And I guess if it could be, it's hard for me to understand, just maybe my human limitation, how a machine could have feelings. And the answer, I guess, is, well, but all those feelings you think you have aren't really feelings. They're just neurons firing. And I guess that's possible.
I guess I'd say two things. One thing is I also find it very hard to understand how a machine, wires and silicone and so on could have feelings. I find it equally hard to imagine how a lump of flesh and meat, above my shoulders can have feelings either. Apparently it does.
It's the fundamental mystery. And Ian McGilchrist on this program in his book, The Master and His Emissary, basically says consciousness is the one thing we have trouble having consciousness about, and that any theory of how it emerges from the brain is almost certainly wrong. But maybe someday they'll solve, philosophers and scientists, as you suggest, will solve this problem. Many have suggested, David Chalmers, most publicly that I know of, that our whole theory of science has to be wrong and reevaluated, because if it can't explain consciousness, which it doesn't seem to be able to, that's very dissatisfying. Something's fundamentally wrong with it.
I would agree with that, but these are early days. I guess I would also say is one way to build a sentient robot is to perfectly duplicate a brain. And, if you could perfectly duplicate a brain, then it's hard to see why that wouldn't count as fully sentient. But it's not the only way. I could imagine there may be many ways to construct intelligence and consciousness. So most, the everyday robots we live in are not duplicates of brains. They work in very different ways.
Yep.
And the machines in Westworld, there may be many routes to consciousness. I don't have any problems to take it out of the AI realm to imagine that in another planet there could be conscious beings that are evolved on a very different planet than ours.
Yeah, that's true.
You sound skeptical.
No. I'm just thinking about it a lot. I'm not skeptical at all. I really don't mean to be. I find that really interesting. I don't. I think it's kind of the Ian McGilchrist point. I don't think my consciousness is capable of absorbing that thought experiment very effectively. Right? How those different consciousnesses would emerge through a different process. I guess part of what I'm reacting to is that the Turing test. Mm-hmm. So I'm talking to this robot or this seemingly human thing. I don't know if it's a human or a robot, and I insult it. Maybe it's my mechanical spouse, my robot spouse at the front desk, and I roll my eyes at the front desk, and the mechanical spouse knows to respond as a human would, and says, and starts crying. You've hurt my feelings, and starts to cry, and has a system built in to replenish tears, of course, mm-hmm. and to have them come out in a way that reminds me of humans, and I understand that I'm going to feel remorse if I'm a good person, that I've hurt the robot's feelings, just like I am sympathetic to the cartoon character with the small nose because it taps into my human DNA that says small creatures with flat noses are like infants. And I look at them and they have big eyes and oversized eyes. I'm going to respond to that emotionally. But I realize in the case of the cartoon that it's just a cartoon.
Yeah.
And I'm not. Should I really feel bad about that robot spouse where I rolled my eyes?
So what you're saying, going back to Westworld,
are they really sad? That's the question. That's the fundamental question, right?
Right. And
if I cause pain, suffering.
Yeah. And if it's, I guess I'd first say, we can never know at a certain level, just like you could never know that for your real spouse.
Yeah, for Descartes. That's a big problem.
Right. It's possible that I'm the only conscious person around.
Yep.
And, it's not possible that you are, because I know I am. But the second thing is, I think in the real world, how you would respond would depend on the complexity of it. If it's a sort of Robbie the robot looking machine, and it says, I am sad, and tears sprout out, and then it spins around a bit, you'd say, well, it's just a toy.
And you got to fill up the tear cartridge. You got to replace the tear cartridge that night.
I'm imagining a little tin can and everything. But if it looks like Thandie Newton from Westworld and starts arguing with you, and it may be irresistible, you may have no choice but to view it as a person. Now, it's possible you would say you're then in the grips of very powerful illusion.
Yeah, I don't know.
Just in some way, like you see images on a TV screen and you immediately say, oh, there's a person and there's a car and there's a house. But it's just images on a 2D screen.
But you cry anyway. I cry anyway at Love Actually in more than one place. And I know that they're just actors pretending.
That's right. And I would bet that if you spent an hour with one of the Westworld characters, the Thandie Newton character, for instance, and then left, and then they said, okay, well, we're going to chop her up into small bits to reconstruct her, you would say, no, you shouldn't. That's murder.
I don't think so. I think it would bother me deep. I think I would howl when the axe fell. I think I would, but that's an illusion too. That would be that bit of information would misinform you about what I really think, because that's not. You're tapping into my deepest uncontrolled responses.
So I'm not asking how you'd react if you had to see the axe fall. I'm asking how we'd react if she left and then you were asked, is that a person?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. Apparently in the TV show, people do not have that reaction. People are entirely comfortable taking these sentient humanoid things and treating them in all sorts of terrible ways, both face to face, but also at a distance. They feel no compulsion to say, "Oh my God, they're people."
I mean, the characters on the show.
The characters. That's right.
Well, that makes a good show.
I think the viewers see it very differently. One of the ironies of the show, which is built into the show, is you very quickly take the side of the robots, and begin to be repelled by the people. Yeah.
Oh, it's a genius idea for sure.
It is.
I don't. I think all of these are. They're wonderful thought experiments, which will come full circle with that. They're wonderful thought experiments that force us to think about our own humanity and what makes moral behavior, how we should treat the people around us.
Absolutely.
My guest today has been Paul Bloom. Paul, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a blast.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.